My name is Michael Laine. I'm the president of Liftport Group. We have been doing these shows for about 5 months now, so twice a week. We just started getting things up onto Spotify, so pretty happy about that. That's kind of a new development for us. So look up DareGreatly space in Spotify, and we're on a bunch of other platforms also. I just don't know what the platforms are just yet. We haven't got quite all of them. I think we're up to 5 of the top 8 or something like that. So pretty happy about that. I just listened to 6 of the 7. I think they're terrific. It's funny because I was there. I was doing the interviews with these people. And yet, while I'm in the interview, there's other things going on. There's stuff in the chat. I'm trying to find links. I'm trying to do support and background stuff while I'm being the host. And so I missed stuff. So even though I was actually physically present for all of those interviews, re-listening to them was really kind of cool. I learned a lot from those episodes. So what do we have? We have 2 episodes with Dr. Roger Lanius. He is the NASA historian. He's retired now. He was the NASA historian for about 15 years. Then he went on to be the curator, associate administrator for the Air and Space Museum. So that's pretty amazing. His career was pretty awesome. So his interview is quite interesting. It was so cool having him on our show that we asked him back immediately after. So he came on just about 2 weeks back to back. I think maybe it was 3 weeks back to back, but we brought him on twice. The first episode was talking about his own history and how he operated at NASA and the Smithsonian Institution. And then the second episode was really talking about what happens next, using history as a lens for the future. And honestly, I think they're both really quite fascinating. So I really recommend that. We had an extra long episode with James Burke. He's the executive director of the Mars Society. We had some technical issues with his program the first time. It got cut off about 15 minutes early. And we didn't cover everything that we wanted to cover. So we brought him back a couple weeks later, had another interview. So that one's also a long interview. It's pretty cool. He gets into some details about Mars Society membership, what's happening in Australia, what's happening in Mongolia, what's happening in the very far north of Canada, the Arctic Circle, what's happening at Mars Desert Research Station in Utah. It talks about the fund for the future, and this is a space show about the money of space. So he talks about the budgets in the Mars Society. Pretty fascinating stuff. I'm a big fan for sure. The other 3 episodes are kind of our normal programming of about an hour. We've got a space investor, a venture capitalist from space, Raphael Rodigen, coming at 1 o'clock in the morning his time from Zurich, Switzerland, talking about his investment thesis and what he wants to put money into and what he's already put money into. Certainly, I think a conversation like that is super important. Michael Doyle, we just today finished the event that Michael Doyle's talking about. So he's the president of Space Northwest. It's a local community group that focuses on the space commercialization effort in the Pacific Northwest. But they've got national reach, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute when we get into our main programming. And then finally, Laura Forsick just went up today. She is an analyst. She runs a company called Astrolytical. Her background's fascinating. When she was younger, in an earlier iteration of her life, she was the gatekeeper to the International Space Station. So who got to fly and what got to go up there is a pretty big deal. So fascinating lineup. That's just 7 of our episodes. We have nearly 10, 15 more to go. So we have a bunch more to post. I told you they're on Spotify. It's also on Apple, Google, and Amazon podcasts. So just type DareGreatly space, and it should be pretty easy to come up. We've had some both positive and negative feedback on the name DareGreatly, and one of the things that's negative is that it's really hard to brand and own because other people think it's a cool phrase also. So you do have to look for DareGreatly space, but that'll work and it'll be great. And I really love your feedback. That would be super useful to us. So please go grab it, download it, subscribe, and let us know what you think. That would be terrific. Thank you very much. All right. That feels like a long intro for today, but let's get into kind of the meat of this. Our show is that intersection of space, money, capital, finance, logistics. It's also about policy and infrastructure development. And we kind of have 3 formats, right? We have a guest speaker sometimes, we have a news roundup, and we have a policy segment. Well, today is a weird day because we have a show that's a little rough around the edges, and I'll tell you why. Just a few hours ago, we wrapped up a session with New Space New Mexico, Defense Innovation Unit, Air Force Research Lab, and the Office of the Chief Scientist of U.S. Space Force. They host an event once a year out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. That is called the State of the Space Industrial Base. And it's a terrible name, and it doesn't really do it justice. And it's really hard to say 5 times in an afternoon. But this SSIB report is a really big deal. And you've heard me talk about it before. I've referenced it a bunch. I genuinely think it's the most important room to be in the whole space sector. I know the folks that run the satellite conference just a couple of weeks ago in Washington, D.C. would disagree. I know the folks in Colorado Springs that are running the Space Symposium in 2 weeks would disagree. But this meeting, I think, is the most important meeting of the space agenda for the whole year. And why do I say that? Well, so the things that go into this meeting are the sausage-making processes that turn into executive orders from the president's office. It filters down to all of the cabinet levels, and eventually it becomes research and development dollars at DARPA, at NASA, at Department of Energy, at Department of Defense. These become research dollars that then turn into research and development projects that then go out to real companies in the space community that then go on to build infrastructure in space. So I know it might sound pretty dull, but these things are really important. This is how the sausage gets made. And if you want the sausage to taste good, you have to be a part of this process. I've been involved with this program for about 3 years, and 2022 was the first one I went to. It's been going on for 5 years. And this collaboration between Air Force Research Lab, U.S. Space Forces, Office of the Chief Scientist, and New Space New Mexico, and Defense Innovation Unit. Those three government agencies, not counting New Space New Mexico, but DIU, AFRL, and Space Forces Office of the Chief Scientist, those three organizations are probably the most forward-looking, futuristic, but also boots on the ground realists in the whole space sector. They are looking at what we have, what we need to compete at an international level, and trying to find the gaps in that space. And so these meetings are pretty important. And what they do is they're a closed door session. They're invite only, and they bring in industry folks who are putting real dollars into the ecosystem, into infrastructure. Sometimes it's federal funds and they're doing research and development, but very often it's venture capital led. And they're looking at who's doing what ways can the government do better, what roadblocks can be moved, pushed out of the way. And some really important stuff comes out of this. So I'll give you an example. Back in 2003, sorry, I don't know what I said, 2003. In 2020, 3 years ago, that's what I was trying to say. In the meeting then, back in May, there was a conversation about power on orbit. And it was a really vague conversation. One of the people in the audience said, power in space equals power and in space. And the way that they meant it was, if you've got the ability to maneuver wherever you want in orbit, if you're not worried about rocket fuel, if you have the ability to refuel, then that gives you leverage to do all sorts of other necessary missions, right? And so back then, 3 years ago, that was the phrase, power in space equals power in space. And it was an acknowledgement of China's rising capabilities, for sure. It was an acknowledgement of European Union's abilities in space. And it was a desire to be really, really good at this stuff. And there wasn't really a lot of talk about what that's supposed to mean. And in the meetings, there's a long history of being descriptive, not restrictive. Describe the capability that you want, the end result that you want. You don't necessarily need to describe how you get there. And that's really important because the government agencies have a strong history of describing what they think they want because it's the only thing that they know. And so this happened a couple of years ago, focused on power. And then fast forward later that year, it became a policy from the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And then from there, it trickled down into the various departments. And the Department of Energy took this really seriously. NASA took it really seriously. DARPA took it really seriously. And out of that, something like 20-some million dollars worth of research and development grants were contracts. I always want to say contracts because grants sounds like it's free money, but it's money with contractual obligations to do real work. So more than $20 million got fed into power in space, and it came out in a bunch of different flavors. It was some was nuclear, some was fusion, and some was solar panels, Well, then fast forward, several companies put in those bids and got awards. I met some of them over the last 2 days, and that was really fun. So today's meeting was really an extension of what happened 3 years ago. Okay, so now we've got some power stuff happening. What are we going to do with it? And so today was a workshop. Yesterday and today was a 2-day workshop held here at the Museum of Flight here in Seattle. There's another workshop happening in Florida and another workshop happening in I think it's Colorado. And all those are happening before the middle of May when they have the big annual program. So the focus of today's program here in Seattle, there were two things that they emphasized. One was power and propulsion, and then the other one was what's called hybrid architecture, which I think is a terribly confusing name, but what it really means is internet in the sky. How do you get broadband internet in the sky, and then from the sky down to the ground, or from the sky to different orbits, or from the sky down to the moon? So how do you build the infrastructure, the communications infrastructure for space? I was not a part of that second one at all. As fascinating as I think that topic is, as vitally important as I think that topic is, I was not a part of that one. I spent the last 2 days focused on power and propulsion. And y'all that don't know me, I don't know power and propulsion. That is not my field, right? So there was somebody in the room that said they were feeling kind of dumb because they weren't nuclear physicists. They were merely rocket scientists. And I thought that was pretty funny, especially because I'm not even a rocket scientist. I'm just a biz dev guy, business development guy. So what was I even doing in the room? I had a lot of perspectives that were pretty important and taken into consideration. Most of my conversations were about money and process, where everyone else was talking about their specific technologies. But that's what this meeting was all about, and it was really great. I don't know when they'll take the information from this one, condense it, present it middle of May into the larger audience, into the larger ecosystem. And there must have been 70 to 100 people over the course of the 2 days. So small, it was small. There were 25, maybe 30 people in my room on the power and propulsion section. So, pretty smart folks really contributing to a very specific agenda. And they, like the Defense Innovation Unit you would expect, they run it with a certain military precision, which I definitely appreciate, being a former corporal of Marines. So it was a really good meeting. There was a lot of stuff that came out of it. I would love to show you the slides of it. It's a little tricky. What I can do is read pieces of it. And I don't really think that's how I want to do it, but that's what I got. So let me see if I can get you this. Give me 10 seconds here. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, let me just see if I can get these to happen. I'm literally downloading these things from my phone. So let's see if I can get this magic to work. Sorry, just give me a second. Nope, that did not do it. This is suddenly getting very awkward. Well, drat. All right. Well, let me read something, and then from this, we're going to talk about the pieces of it. And I'll try and put it on screen while we're talking, but that's a different problem. Okay. So the way that they do this is they look at history to inform the present, and then take those two pieces of information, the last 12 months and today, and they use that to project out to the next 18 months to 3 to 5 years. So let me see if I can read this to y'all. All right. First, and I'm just going to put this up on the screen here for a second. So what has happened in the last 12 months that is significant to this power and propulsion environment? Well, I'm going to read it directly, and then I'll try to translate it. There's 4 things. I'm going to take them a piece at a time. Number 1, multiple signs of progress across the U.S. government. Number 2, new developments in RTG technologies, radioactive thermal technologies, policy and oversight, and continued emergence of non-traditional power and propulsion. So there's paragraphs around each one. So the first one is multiple signs of progress across the U.S. government. Targeted U.S. government programs, DARPA, NASA, AFRL, Defense Innovation. Let me say that again. DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA is famous for creating both the internet and GPS. NASA, of course, you know. AFRL is Air Force Research Lab. That's the R&D group of the Air Force. And also Space Force. That's important to note that AFRL has control over Space Force research dollars. And DIU, Defense Innovation Unit. Defense Innovation Unit is this kind of outside the normal channels. It's not quite a venture capital group for the Department of Defense, although it definitely acts as a lighthouse organization that says, okay, this is safe passage. This area is interesting to the government. They have a super small budget, just a few, $10 million or so. And they put little tiny checks in the hands of industry. And then the hope is that Silicon Valley and all of their billions and trillions will follow Defense Innovation Unit's lead. DIU is a super important thing because they've only been around for 5 years. And yesterday, while we were at the meeting, they announced a new director of Defense Innovation Unit, and that new director reported directly to the Secretary of Defense. So the room that we were in yesterday, it goes, us to General Buto to the Director of Defense Innovation Unit, Director of Innovation Unit goes directly to the Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense goes directly to President Biden. So pretty short chain of command for the folks in the room there. So going back to this, multiple signs of progress across the U.S. government, targeted U.S. government programs, DARPA, NASA, Air Force Research Lab, Defense Innovation Unit, signify a cultural shift towards advanced nuclear power propulsion, advanced nuclear space power and propulsion. That's an important line to put in the space piece. Focus lines of effort aimed at maturation and validating operationally relevant demonstrations. Demonstrations. I can't tell you how many times we heard demo. Let's go build something and then show that we can build it and go get customers. U.S. Space Force's tactically responsive space line of effort, along with maneuverability, requirements of spacecraft, drive the need for low-cost, available, low-maintenance handling propellant systems for propulsion. So they're like, look, the tech is out there, it's getting better. We need to expand on these research and development projects. So that's been happening. There are programs of record in these 4 agencies, and so they are maturing these technologies. So the next thing is new developments of RTG technology. Honestly, folks, I'm not gonna sit here and BS you. I did not know most of what they were talking about. They were talking about radioactive isotopes, and this one is better than that one because of this other reason, and we don't want highly enriched technologies because that could be weapons class technologies. What can we do? So I will read this stuff to you, but I'm not going to pretend to understand it. AM 241, which I learned was americium. I didn't learn that. I knew that. AM 241 baseline for ExoMars. So that's a mission that's out there now that the Europeans are working on. And that the NASA Office of the Inspector General radioisotope program report was very strict, very strong, basically saying NASA's not keeping up. And then there's rising domestic and international interest in non-plutonium RTGs, radiothermal generators. So this area of the conversation, I followed along, but this isn't an area I'm paying a lot of attention to. So I really wasn't aware of the news in this sector. It's fascinating. I had no idea this technology was moving as quickly as it was. The next thing, and again, all this stuff has happened over the last 12 months. So the next thing is policy and oversight. Coordinated activity to drive executive orders, and they list several executive orders, so that's pretty important. But they want to change executive orders into long-term legislation. So if it's just an executive order, that can be changed by the next president. That can be changed by the next policy. So what they want is they want it codified into federal law, and that can only happen at Congress. So I thought that was a really interesting distinction. I guess I knew that intellectually, but I had never been in a situation where it was important to me. So that was actually, I learned a lot from that part of the discussion. There's continued activity to define and implement ground rules for these policies. The Artemis Accords are a big help. Codified Space Force doctrine that will be addressed through additional power, advanced power and propulsion. And then there's a rising interest in resolving isotope supply chain issues. Oh man, they talked about supply chain issues over and over and over again. Again, not an area I'm very familiar with because we're not doing that kind of research. In the Seattle region, we have the Kent Industrial Valley, just a few miles from here. And we're really used to having some of the best mechanical engineering folks in the world right down the street from us. So it was kind of surprising to hear. The concern they had about supply chain issues, and it wasn't just COVID anymore. It's also the military invasion from Russia into Ukraine. That's got some stuff going on. There's some supply chain issues with China. Yeah, that was pretty interesting. So the last piece, continued emergence of non-traditional power and propulsion. So that is starting to bubble to the surface. There's a lot of technologies. I'm going to skip that and move to the next piece. So that's all the stuff that was happening in the last year. And then challenges and issues that we're dealing with today is there's a problem, interest versus demand. Again, I know you can't really see that, but maybe people want to freeze frame that. There's, I kind of love the idea that there's They call it innovation in deep tech tourism does not stimulate big bets or lead to gated development programs and or meaningful contracts. What they're saying there is that, and I really hammered this part home, is that the SBIR, STTR programs are fundamentally broken, and that what they call deep tech tourism, what that means is like, okay, we're going to put a little bit into here and a little bit into that, and a little bit into this other thing, and they have diluted the money so much to so many different things. Somebody called it getting a merit badge. It didn't really have a lot of impact or meaning. They just give out these contracts without any sort of like forethought about what they will do once they complete that 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, 180-day contract. And that's what they mean by tourism, deep tech tourism. I'm not going to get into the weeds about the difference between TAC-FI and STRAT-FI, but I will tell you that those are programs that a private company like us could tap into. It's a government matching program where if we go and find $1 of private capital, the government will put $2 of private capital into a contract. That's giant. What venture company doesn't want that? Except there's only one path into it, and it's super restrictive. So can we get that expanded? There's talk about instability in residual COVID issues, military conflicts, high demand. There's financial uncertainty for capital investments. The interest rates, for a conference that was supposed to be focused on advanced technology, propulsion, and energy, we spent an awful lot of time talking about the business of our businesses. There were probably, with the 25 to 30 people in the room, it probably represented a dozen, maybe 15 companies, and everybody was having the same basic problem. So that was actually really interesting to kind of hear that. And this is one that I really loved. Solicitations are stuck in the Department of Defense comfort zones. So there was one really smart guy who was like, if all you know how to do is authorize incremental developments for balloons and the blueprints for an airplane come across your desk, you will not risk your career on that new invention. And me, I want to build an elevator. I want to build a space elevator. We have been a square peg in a round hole problem for a really long time. So for me, it was really refreshing to have somebody on the other side of the room say, in a way that the Department of Defense could hear, that innovative ideas are not getting into the system because the system is fundamentally broken. And that was refreshing because I've been saying it for a really long time, but it's going to appear in an official document. So we'll see if this makes it through the next round, but I think it will. There was a pretty strong sentiment there. The phrase is solicitation stuck in Department of Defense comfort zones, overly prescriptive, not capability driven. By asserting lengthy requirements that are not integral or open system architecture related, not taking advantage of sound solutions and small and non-traditional inhibits, diminishes participation. Okay, so these are not sentences, these are bullet points, but this is something I was really stressing, by the way. Insufficient technical expertise or awareness within the Department of Defense or U.S. government negatively impacts communications and collaboration. There was one guy in there who's like, look, if we have to explain how the basic atom works, we're talking to the wrong people. And that's true. Okay, so how this is happening traditionally is that in our case, the Office of the Chief Scientist of U.S. Space Force writes a technology roadmap. That's what he wants. That's his plan for the future. And there's a classified version and an unclassified version. So this unclassified version makes its way down from the Office of the Chief Scientist down to the generals, to lieutenant colonels, to the majors. I missed colonel there. From the office to the generals, to the colonels, to the lieutenant colonels, to the majors, to the captains, and God forbid it lands on the desk of a lieutenant somewhere. And the orders from above get diluted as they go further down, because that captain or that lieutenant who actually has to read all of the solicitations, all the proposals to the solicitations, they have to make a decision, fund this one or fund this one. And if they get, 500 proposals for 50 research grants, there has to be some criteria for spending the government's money on these things. And so at the lieutenant's level, at the captain's level, they don't have deep zone expertise to properly evaluate the things they're coming across. So the guy that was at the meeting there, he's like, look, if all you know and all you're willing to do is continue to invest in better balloon technology, can you even recognize when somebody brings you an airplane? Do you know what it means? Do you know what it's for? Do you know how it can help you? And the sad fact is that's the case. That's where we've been stuck for 2 decades. But it's especially painful now because there's just simply no path for us. And that's pretty disappointing. That's pretty disappointing, which is why I go to these meetings. That is why I go, because I want a path for us. So, so that's kind of like the conditions that we're in today. And then, whoops, wrong one. And then they have kind of recommendations, like, okay, well, where do we go from here, right? And I'm going to kind of read through these. There's actually quite a few. Funded flight demos exhibit operational utility. One thing that they're worried about is any nuclear event that happens in space or on Earth could reinvigorate fear of all things nuclear. There was a conversation in the meeting about how an earthquake that led to a tidal wave that led to the reactors in Fukushima being flooded set the whole nation of Japan's nuclear program back 20 years. And the idea of putting nuclear, reactive material into space to expand our space capabilities, there's definitely some folks that do not like that plan. So we have to kind of really be careful that there's no accidents. And even if it's not us, even if it's not the space community, even if it happens on the ground, it's still, there's still folks that are really afraid of that. So, we talked a lot about multiple commercial heavy launch systems. That was super fun. Everybody in the room kind of took that as a given, right? That there's the 2 big ones, New Glenn and Starship, and maybe three big ones, Falcon Heavy. But that there's, 12.5 small launchers that want to grow up to be big launchers. So we all kind of took easy access to orbit as kind of a given for all of our decisions. So I thought that was pretty interesting. We talked a little bit about existing government programs decide to move forward. And then we also talked about, China. What happens if, the national competitor that we're all thinking about does any of this stuff before us? So there's a lot here. It's going to be a great report. I'm looking forward to it. I know it's really deep in the weeds. You know that we get deep in the weeds in this show because the weeds are important. The weeds are where the research and development happens. It's where the money comes from, is by rooms like this. So I'm gonna cut that off now. I think we've covered as much as we can possibly stand from it. It's an important event. It's a part of a larger system. The rest of the system will take place in about 6-7 weeks. I'll share more when I've got more. There's definitely going to be a paper that comes out. There's going to be a summary document. I'm not really sure if it's going to be like rise to the level of being a paper, but there will be a summary document that goes out. I took a ton of notes. I'm not going to get into that stuff now. But it was cool, and you know what? It was fun. It was neat because I told several people over the last couple of days, we have not done any work on the lunar elevator in 3 years, since the minute the pandemic kind of took over our lives, and I mean like the world's lives and my own life. I've said many times, we came really close to closing the doors and shutting down. And it was these media projects that kept us alive. So pretty happy about that. But I've been disappointed that we haven't done any work on the space elevator, on the lunar space elevator infrastructure. And so this was kind of the first time I've felt like I was doing like that job in 3 years. So it's fun to be the space elevator guy. I really like it. I think I'm kind of good at it. And it felt like I really contributed to this community from a pretty unique perspective, and that my perspective was heard and was incorporated into these documents. So pretty happy about that. These are organizations where they just don't give attribution. Nobody's getting credit for this, and that's the way it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be that way. But it was really nice to be able to participate and feel like I got Liftport just a little bit closer to getting an elevator on the moon constructed. We'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. There is a ton of follow-up from this event. But I can see a couple different paths that lead to new contracts for us, new research and development, new media projects. So just across the board, it really felt like it was a real accomplishment. So I'm pretty happy about that. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and close out early. I don't have a whole lot more to share. I think the whole world knows that that NASA figured out who's going to do the flyby of the moon. So super excited about that. I think that's giant news. I think it's important to everyone. I think it's important to women. I think it's important to people of color. I think it's important to the world that we're going back to the moon. And I'm just really happy for the folks that are going to be on that mission, and that it's one step closer. So I think that the whole thing's exciting, but I don't really have any more to editorialize or add to it other than just that I'm enthusiastic about it. Other news, Virgin officially declared bankrupt. It's trading at 15 cents a share. I feel bad for all the folks that had Virgin stock. I am not one of them. But, I have said publicly many times I was skeptical of how they structured that. I think some of the stuff that Branson did was pretty bad for the company. So I'm gonna blame this on one person and one person's agenda, and I only know the information that comes from the news. But that's how I feel about it. So I'm pretty angry about what happened there. I'm sure a lot of other people are angry there. That one feels pretty personal because I was on the tarmac. I was on the field when Burt Rutan, funded by Paul Allen, won the X Prize. And to see, and everybody asks, like, why did Paul Allen spend $20 million to win a $10 million prize? What they may not know is that just a few weeks after that, Branson came in with $100 million and ordered a series of spacecraft, and that was the beginning of Virgin. And then, if that's not enough, about 2 years after that, I think it was the royal Saudi family put another $300 million into it to build out, Middle East assets, right? And so I love the X Prize. I love what the X Prize catalyzed for the whole space industry. So hats off to them. A $50,000 basically gift from the Rotary Group from St. Louis turned into a $500,000 gift from Anusha Ansari and her family. That $500,000 funded a $10 million insurance policy. That $10 million insurance policy funded a $100 million investment from Richard Branson. That $100 million turned into another $100 million in New Mexico spaceport and $300 million from the Saudi family. That's a pretty good ROI. And the industry that we live in now, with more than 20 funded venture funded rocketry companies, launch companies, that's a heck of an ROI from a small group in St. Louis. So hats off to you folks. Appreciate the boost you gave us. But I did not like how Virgin operated. I have not liked it for a long time. I like many of the people. I really admire George Whitesides and a couple other folks. But from an outsider's perspective, it's been pretty hard to watch. And so 15 cents per share, that's a pretty rough ending to a much greater legacy. So hats off to the folks at the X Prize who got this whole thing catalyzed and started. If anybody was going to build a rocketry company, I really thought it was going to be Virgin. So I'm pretty surprised that this is where we're at. Anyway, with that, I'm going to head and close out. Thank you, everybody, for listening tonight. Definitely want to check out the Spotify channel. And with that, I'm just going to say thanks to my team. Jen is doing a great job on engineering. She doesn't know it yet, but she's got some new tasks based off of the meeting that I went to yesterday and today. Sing Key is doing a great job in audio and video editing. Leah, always a great job at operations. Thanks for doing all this stuff. And of course, Leah, our on staff journalist, terrific job all of you. Thank you. We couldn't do this stuff without you. So appreciate everybody for listening. We'll see you on Monday. Next week, we've got Jeremy, the CEO from Rogue Space. So that's going to be fun. I don't know very much about Rogue Space, so I'm really excited to learn. We got confirmation that Peter Garrettson is going to join us from the Foreign Council, the American Foreign Policy Council, a think tank in DC. Mandy Vaughn from Embedded Ventures. She's a former CEO of Vox Aerospace, and Vox used to be a part of Virgin. And she's on the National Space Council. Rich Harrison is going to try and make it. We're not really sure if that's going to happen or not because of family obligations. But we've got a great lineup coming up, so just stick with us, and we'll talk to you. We'll talk to you all soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye, y'all.